Good morning, everyone. Welcome at this online webinar related to Log4j. We will give the visitors a few more minutes to attend this meeting, so there's still some time to grab a beverage if you like, whereafter you can sit down and enjoy the presentation my colleague Ralph prepared for you. So hold on. Look at that. I see that most of the attendees are there yet. So as I mentioned before, good morning, everyone. Welcome at this online webinar related to Log4j, a topic currently trending in news and online media due to its criticality and the successful exploitation across the world. During the Christmas holidays, successful hacks have occurred in that matter that even the FTC, the Federal Trading Commission, takes it that seriously and strongly advise to take immediate action to avoid potential penalties. Even the Belgian Department of Defense is, as we speak, running a full-blown investigation after a breach related to Log4j vulnerability. Well, as you probably know, Secura is packed with cybersecurity experts, security consultants, and registered auditors, providing security offerings for more than 20 years already. Our focus is performing security tests, inspections, and audits, all this to bring customers the insight in their digital security by providing the correct metrics using common standards and criteria. Where needed, we can guide our customers to a higher cybersecurity maturity level by providing consultancy, trainings, and awareness programs, supporting our strong belief that security is not only a matter of technology, but also need focus on people and process. So we are organized in market groups to provide every customer the guidance, love, and attention they need, focusing on their business needs, whether that is IT, like infrastructures, web, or cloud services, IoT, so all sorts of smart devices and surrounding technology, or even OT, operational technology, thinking in industrial security, like SCADA systems, ICS, PLCs, like that. And since January last year, we are part of Bureau Veritas Group, a multinational with its core business in tech services, so focusing on testing, inspecting, and certifying customers on a global level. We're happy to be a member of Bureau Veritas Group, taking our services to the next level. So just some small things about the webinar. It will take approximately 45 minutes, give or take. My name is Sander Peters. I'm responsible for the technology market group. I will be your host today, trying to run things smoothly. For questions, you can drop your thoughts in the question box, and I will take a look whether there's an option to answer them directly or handle them right after the presentation, depending on time available. It's my honor to introduce our CTO, Ralph Moden. Happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sander. So yeah, after that introduction, I think we'll dig in straight away. So I don't know, of course, how much background our listeners have, so I will start with a little bit of background on this vulnerability. So the last few weeks have been pretty hectic also for us, but at many of our customers also, because there is a bug in Log4j, and this bug has been dubbed Log4Shell. So Log4j is the name of the software, Log4Shell is the name of the vulnerability. And in a way, it is very a new type of vulnerability, sure, but it's also not. So what it boils down to, as a bit of understanding on how it works, is that applications and infrastructures, they take input from users or from other systems, and in a secure system, that input should be validated. So it should be checked to see whether it contains malicious code, whether it contains maybe unexpected input. So if it's expecting a number and it is given a character string, well, obviously that does not match, so the input validation would fail. It could also be if it expects a positive integer and you give it a negative integer, then again, input should fail. Now, in this case, it's a bit more interesting, because what happens is that the Log4j software, of course, is used for logging purposes. And it is pretty common in logging to actually just log the input that the user gave and not do any input validation on that. Over the years, we've done many penetration tests, and every time, pretty much every single application that we look at has some kind of input validation finding. So you should consider an application, and we see that, for instance, in a certain parameter, or maybe just in an input field or in a comment field in a website, you type in the characters, and it turns out that those characters are then processed in the back-end system without any filtering, without any validation. And normally this doesn't really matter, because other security mechanisms are in place to make sure that those malicious things don't get into any parts of the application where they can cause harm. But typically we have always added a risk note to say that, okay, well, we haven't found a way to actually abuse this vulnerability, because there is no underlying vulnerability to abuse this input validation error or input validation lack in the back end. Yeah, that is until someone did discover a vulnerability in that back end, and that is Log4j. So in a sense, it's nothing new. It's one of the input validation, missing input validation vulnerabilities, and OWASP top 10 has that in the top 10 forever. So in that sense, it's nothing new. However, it is a bit different than other ones, and I'll try to explain how it works first. So there is a payload string, and it contains a URL and some other characters, so curly brackets and other things. I'll show you an example later. You can send this payload string in any type of input that is exposed to the outside world. So if you have a web application, it could be in the URL itself. And if you have a web application that uses certain cookies, it could be in the cookies. You could send it even in the email headers in an email situation. These are all common things that are also logged. So if that software package, Log4j, and case you're wondering why it says Log4j 2 here. So there is also a Log4j version 1. That one is not vulnerable to this specific vulnerability that we're talking about. So this CVE. This is only Log4j 2. And as Log4j parses the input to log, it comes across this string, this payload that the attacker has inserted, and it triggers on that. So it says, well, hey, look, oh, I understand what this says. This says that I should, and in this case, go and get an external Java class file from another server, download that, and execute that. So as soon as it sees that string, it will do so. So whenever you can trick a system into going to another website and downloading a other piece of software and executing that on the server, we call that a remote code execution vulnerability. And of course, those are one of the worst. And as this can be triggered by an external attacker who is not logged in or authenticated to the system at all, it is an unauthenticated remote code execution, or an unauth RCE, as we abbreviate that. And yeah, it's one of the worst types of vulnerabilities that we know. So the server will request and to contact the malicious server, and purely in that downloading of the remote Java class file, so the remote code, you can already leak information. And the reason that that is so is that there's certain variables on the server that can be expanded with a dollar sign. So if you include a dollar sign and between curly brackets some environment variable, it will expand that, and you can use that to exfiltrate data. So if you are running, for instance, in some kind of Docker environment, you can export maybe AWS secret keys that are valid within that Docker environment. You can exfiltrate any kind of other environment variable, Java versions, the actual host name, the internal IP address, all kinds of environment parameters that are there. So even without the remote code execution already, just purely the fact that this will resolve a host name and do a DNS call can leak the secret information. How is that possible? Well, simply put, you include the URL where the remote code resides in that payload, and it includes a host name, and of course you can make that host name whatever you want. So you can make the host name dependent on those secret keys, environment variables, etc. So for instance, it could be $AWS secret key .secura.com, and it would expand that to the actual secret key .secura.com and do a DNS request for that host. Of course, we're listening on the DNS at secura.com, so we can already see in the logs what those variables expand to. So that's how you exfiltrate information just in the first, or actually in the second step. Of course, the third step is to actually go to the server, download the payload, and then execute that payload. Now, what would you use that for? What would an attacker use that for? Well, there's actually 2 or 3 ways that attackers use this. First of all, well, obviously spawning backdoors for long-term access. This ultimately usually will lead to some kind of ransomware attack. This is what we would be calling an initial access. So it doesn't mean that they have then got persistent access to your network yet, but yeah, that's what they want. So a backdoor to get in later is definitely one of their goals. And the second one is, of course, to steal your CPO to do cryptocurrency mining. And there have been several actual attacks over the last week on, I think Onus was one of the companies that got hit with cryptocurrency miners. And even in the Netherlands, there have been already confirmed cases of companies being hacked through Log4j, where cryptocurrency miners were installed. So I'll get to that later, but these cryptocurrency miners also use up a lot of CPU, so they are detectable in that way. The backdoors, they don't always have to be very detectable, because when the payload is downloaded, it's a Java class file, but it resides in most environments. It would reside in RAM, so it doesn't necessarily get spooled to disk. It can be just residing in RAM. That means that when you do a forensic investigation afterwards, if you think you have been hit, you will not find a lot of forensic evidence on the disk of that payload, except in the log files, maybe that a HTTP get, or actually another type of get, a JINDI get, would have taken place to get the payload. But it's not necessarily the case that you can always find out what that payload was, especially if it's been removed from the remote server after it has been retrieved. Anyway, so once that remote class file has been downloaded and executed, now suddenly you have a compromised and backdoored system. But what system is that? Because we have a lot of customers that say, yes, please scan our external visibility of Log4j, so the external attack surface, and that's fine. We can do a lot in scanning, but it's only a part of the problem, because while an attacker can see, for instance, a web server and try to inject the payload on all kinds of HTTP parameters, who is to say that for instance, if you have an e-commerce website, that the HTTP requests aren't logged at a later date when, for instance, the quarter results have to be calculated and everything is imported into a backend database that is not internet connected. This is only done once in 3 months, so the vulnerability actually is triggered not when the attack takes place, but 3 months later, when the data is transferred to a vulnerable system and processed there. That's what makes this vulnerability quite difficult to track and find when doing scanning from the internet. Another example would be where, let's say you have a login page and the username and password, of course, after 10 attempts of failed login, is logged as a brute force attack on the login page. So that means that the first 9 times the username is probably not logged, and then the 10th time it is logged, because now it is suddenly classified as a brute force attempt, and then your security system will try to log the actual HTTP requests. So the first 9 times nothing happens, and the 10th time the attack is tried, now we trigger the Log4j vulnerability. So where and how exactly this vulnerability is triggered in the back end or in systems is very unpredictable, and it's pretty much up to the fantasy of the attacker to think of all kinds of injection vectors to get to back end applications. So maybe it's a database somewhere, maybe it ends up in operating system logs that are then transferred to, let's say, a Splunk system or whatever, or in the VMware layer. And then it becomes a question of, wow, well, where is this Log4j used? So let's get, I'll park that question where it is used to in a few slides. Anyway, first of all, I think you might have understood by now that this is a pretty bad vulnerability. So it has the maximum CV score of 10, which means basically that it has an unauthenticated remote code execution that is also capable of expanding its scope. What do they mean with that? They mean that if you hack the system that it's on, you can use that to access other systems. Well, obviously that is the case here. And it's one of the worst vulnerabilities. In fact, last year, one of my colleagues also discovered a CVSS 10 score vulnerability, zero logon, it was called. It allowed an attacker to take over a Windows domain purely based on having network access within a Windows domain and become domain controller. So these are the kinds of vulnerabilities that we score a 10. Also interesting, of course, is that it was found in the beginning of December, and it was already actively used by malicious actors before the patch was there. If I'm correct, that I think it was the Cisco Talos group, they do a lot of threat hunting and disclosures. They found, I think, that December 1st was the first time that they saw this attack being exploited in the wild. So what is affected, aka where is Log4j used? Well, unfortunately, it's pretty common. It's used in Apache Tomcat, it's used in games like Minecraft, it's also used in VMware, and of the first companies that were reported vulnerable, I mean, Apple and Tesla were there, Blender, Adobe, well, basically everyone. And anything running Java could potentially be affected. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that Java is such an embedded part of a lot of the infrastructure that it's very difficult to assess whether or not it also uses Log4j. Case in point, many printers use Log4j. Well, but which ones exactly, we don't know. Well, on the top right of this slide, you see a cartoon that was already famous because it was like many years ago. I think this was a cartoon from 2018 or something from XKCD, who accurately predicted that some kind of part of the modern digital infrastructure was maintained by some random guy in Virginia or West Virginia, and it supports the whole internet. And of course, if it is removed, the infrastructure can collapse. XKCD, by the way, is a very humorous nerd cartoon, so highly recommended. Anyway, as soon as the vulnerability became known, the Dutch NCSC, so the National Cybersecurity Center, they rallied and gathered all cyber defenders, and we had a couple of really interesting conference calls. And one of the things that came out of that was that we were going to start a GitHub repository where all information on Log4j, or the vulnerability Log4Shell, would be collated. So that is one of our main resources. It's gotten a lot of international traction also. It's not the only one. So the American CISA also has one, but this one is actually, especially for the Dutch market, very interesting. And one of the things there is that it contains a large list of products that use Log4j. So if you go to this URL, you will be able to find a list of products and the versions that are vulnerable or have a patch or what you should do. So if you have any questions on, well, I use VMware version blah, is this vulnerable or not? This is the place to go to see all those products in one page. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go to the individual vendor pages and find out what the vendors' advisories are themselves. But yeah, this is an excellent starting point. Another thing that you can find on this GitHub page is tools. So if you need to validate whether or not Log4j is installed on a local machine, there are scripts that you can download from this page, run on your servers, and it will tell you whether Log4j is present on those servers. It will not tell you if it's running or if it is ever called, but you can at least find if it is there. Okay. So what happened since the start? Well, a little bit of the timeline. I already mentioned this, and the original vulnerability was discovered by someone in the Alibaba cloud security team, and they reported it. And just after that, on the 1st of December, actually the first exploitation was reported. Interesting to note, though, that just a few days before that, since this is open source software, the pull requests, aka the changes that are proposed to a piece of software, they're all publicized. So for an attacker monitoring open source projects and looking at pull requests on GitHub, this can be a very good source of early warning information or actual threat information that a certain vulnerability might be present. Because if you're seeing that a piece of software is being modified to address a vulnerability, that they don't explicitly say what that vulnerability is, then you can, of course, go and look and say, hey, it used to be this, now it's this. Oh, they've changed something, wait. And this is, in fact, how a lot of threat actors, also on the nation state level, how they work. If Microsoft publishes on Patch Tuesday CVEs for their the new versions of Windows or some kind of DLL or whatever, and you read in the press release from Microsoft that, oh, this patch addresses a CVE, so a vulnerability with a CVSS rating of 9 or 9.5, then you might think, wow, okay, that must be a really serious vulnerability. Let's go and look what actually changed in the code. Now, in the case of a DLL, you would have to do a binary analysis between the previous version of the DLL and the patched version of the DLL and do some reverse engineering. But you can bet that especially state actors and other malicious groups, they do this. So if they see then that some kind of memory leak was addressed, then they know, then it's a memory leak vulnerability, and they can start working on creating an exploit for that. So just the fact that something is patched and something is changing gives attackers information about what that vulnerability is. Usually it could take a few days to exploit this if it's an easy one. In this case, it was a really easy one, so it only took 1 day after the vulnerability was disclosed on GitHub to be exploited in the wild. So then it took another 10 days, 1.5, 2 weeks to actually get to a public released exploit, which was then also published on first on Twitter and then on GitHub. So that is when everyone panicked. Currently, still, we are looking at global triage of how bad things are, patching and preventing further damage. So the latest news on that is that it does not seem to be as actively exploited as was feared first. What did happen was that after the patch was published, new vulnerabilities were discovered in the new versions, and then another patch was released. So you might have found that when you patched to 2.16, you figured out that, hey, there's a new version 2.17, and there's a new CVE, and wow, what's going on? The new vulnerability that was addressed in 2.17 is actually a bit of an overhyped and rather, it's not as bad. To exploit that vulnerability, you already need to be on the server and have access to the configuration file of Log4j. So if you have that as an attacker, then there's loads of other things and you're in worse trouble than just this vulnerability. So just to be clear, if you are on 2.16 and you have time left and you think, let's update to 2.17, that's fine. However, that is not necessary if you want to be protected to this CVSS 10 score log4shell. So if you want to be protected with that, updating to 2.16.1 is enough. Also, the additional denial of service vulnerabilities that were found, they only work in certain specific conditions and are not a big risk. Most vendors by now have also provided patches or workaround. Again, see the list of the NCSC. And most of our customers actually had a reasonable overview. I'm not going to say a very good overview, but a reasonable overview of their assets. Of course, in some companies, it did really show that asset management is one of the things that requires attention, because if you want to know what to patch, then you first have to know what you're using and where you're using it. So the CIOs or CISOs that were asking, hey, IT guys, where are we using Log4j? They actually were not in a situation where they could easily answer that question. Some parts were known, yeah, and especially when you're looking at big other pieces of software such as VMware, then it's pretty clear where those are used. But if it's embedded in some kind of other piece of software on Tomcat, or maybe even in printers or network equipment, other software stacks, it becomes suddenly quite untrivial to find those. Anyway, again, please go to the site of the vendors, the site of the NCSC to see the list of vendors. So the fact that it is easily exploited is, of course, one of the key things here, and that also means that it can be very hard to defend against. The various actors are scanning 24/7, and if you have a vulnerable server on the internet currently, you must assume it is already compromised. In fact, we had some customers that were they knew that they were exposed for 2 days. Yeah, they found the Log4j finally. They patched it, but they had been out there for a couple of days while the public exploit was known. Yeah, what should you do? Should you consider yourself breached? That depends a little, of course, on your threat model. It would be safe to say that there is a chance that you have been breached in that case, and you should rebuild servers, or at least do some kind of forensics examination to figure out if those servers indeed were breached. But again, that can be tricky because, as I said earlier, some of those attacks reside purely in RAM. So that makes it difficult. And in those cases, I think that it is better to start looking back through your logs, doing some threat hunting, see if you find some indicators of compromise, to see if you can actually see what has been going on. All right. How to mitigate this then? If you cannot patch or you don't know where Log4j is being used, there are some other ways to do that. First of all, the attacker will be sending this payload. If this payload passes through any kind of filtering device, such as a web application firewall, a WAF, then you can filter that there. In the example that you see at the top left, the actual evil string, so the Jindy LDAP call with the URL and the host, is in the user agent string, and you can use a WAF to block that. Now, this doesn't fix your application, and WAFs are also notorious for being, bypassable. There's all kinds of encoding tricks that you can use to bypass WAF rules, but nevertheless, if you have a WAF, you should be doing this. Then the second, of course, is that the string has to be passed to Log4j for logging. And yeah, if the Log4j instance itself has been patched, then again, you don't have a problem there. Now, the thing is that, of course, you don't know always how data is processed on the back end. It might go into a log first and then into a secondary log aggregator later, which does use Log4j. So there's a bit of a thing there. Anyway, one of the key things here to take into account is that the lookup and the download of the actually malicious class file are two separate steps. So what do we mean with the lookup? Well, if you look at the evil string, it says ldap : / well, in this case, evil.exe. That means that the DNS server will have to do a lookup of evil.exe. And that also means that you can see that in your DNS logs and you can block that, right? And the same goes for the actual downloading of that class file, because it also means that the server on which the LDAP request is processed is not, well, it's connected to the internet and has to download it. Then the obvious mitigation here, of course, is to block outgoing internet connections from servers. Or at least block, put certain servers on the allow list. So if you want to block outgoing internet access on a server, you run automatically into the problem that, for instance, software updates will be impacted. So typically, we would not advise to do that. What we would advise is to put those software update servers on the allow list and block all other internet access from servers, at least definitely from production servers, but typically also from any other servers. This used to be like a common recommendation that everyone would make when doing pen tests. I don't see this recommendation a lot anymore in a lot of pen test reports from many companies. And it's always been a bit of a puzzle to me. Have we given up on disallowing internet access from servers simply because it's so handy? Or, yeah, I don't know. I can't really explain that. But we're seeing a lot of cases where servers have, uncontrolled internet access. Not a good idea at all. Other things, of course, to take into account are disabling a remote code base. Of course, that doesn't help against the information disclosure and leaking of secrets, because, as I said earlier, that is done through the host name and the expansion of the environment variables. So, yeah, you can't really help that. Looking at triage, how to know whether you are impacted. Well, as I said before, if you get a list of the software that is used and the external facing, you can look for Log4j. If you have a software bill of materials, so SBOM, then you can just go through that. But that is pretty difficult to do, and most companies that I know have extremely failing asset management processes. They don't know what they have. And yeah, this is one of those cases that make it really difficult to do triage. However, I think that, especially this case now that we have on hand with Log4j will give quite a bit of, momentum to companies investing more in asset management processes. Okay, so if you go to the NCSC page, you will be able to find scanners that run on local hosts. So these are local scanners. You can download these scripts and you can actually find any instance of Log4j on the servers. And if you find, of course, any internet fading system that was vulnerable, start the incident response. Because if it was exposed for, some time, a day, 2 days, there is definitely a chance that it was backdoored, and already the actors are trying to use that as a stepping stone into your network, do lateral movement, or try to do privilege escalation and become administrator, etc. on those systems. You can also start to look for early indicators of compromise in the other systems, of course, and that means that you would be typically looking at known IP addresses of malicious servers and other indicators of malware, and there is a lot of resources there, but of course you have to know what those IP addresses are. So the URL here is one of those Log4Shell known IPs. Also take a look at the higher CPU usage than before. Why is that relevant? Well, for the crypto miners, as I mentioned before, also have that as a side channel to find. They use higher CPU usage. If you're doing temperature monitoring on any of your servers, that is also a thing to take a look at, because CPU usage also typically goes hand in hand with a higher temperature if you're, for instance, afraid that on your OT environment, where you're typically not monitoring CPU usage, but you are monitoring temperature, that might be also a way to find out if you are compromised or not. And network traffic is, of course, also one. So you could look at NetFlow stats to look for that. And yeah, good old grep in the logs for the specific Jindy payload also helps. If you go a little further, then you would actually have to look at how to detect the vulnerability being exploited. And really the only way that you can do that is if you have historical data and you can compare network flows, and if you have more depth and richness of that information, the better it is. Just having the net flow data is great, but if you have verbose network logs, that would be even better. And of course, having vulnerable hosts in your network means that when an attacker has a foothold using Log4j, Log4Shell, they will try to do lateral movement and privilege escalation through the other vulnerable hosts in your network. So knowing where they are and what those vulnerabilities are is also key to being able to do incident response. So that means that you would be hopefully running vulnerability management platforms, not just on your external attack surface, but also on your internal attack surface, so on your internal network. Because if you have some Samba version 1 Eternal Blue and a vulnerability somewhere on your network, you can be sure that the attacker will find it and will exploit that. So can Secura assist in some of these cases? Yes, definitely. We're doing our best.
Just to break in, Ralph, we have a few more minutes left
Yep.
before the questions. Just to let you know.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Well, we're pretty much there. So we're working closely with the NCSC. We are doing scanning services for our customers, mostly external. We have, of course, incorporated the checks and tests for Log4Shell in our standard application and other penetration testing services. So it's just gone into the process. It's not yet completely business as usual because new injection vectors are being discovered on a daily basis, and some things are quite limited there. We have a small forensics team that has already done some forensics investigations for our customers. So that's another way that we can support customers in that. The external attack surface scanning service that we have actually leverages a couple of security tools that do scanning on HTTP services. So you can go to our webpage and read about that. So to summarize, well, yes, it's that bad. The vulnerability can be abused. However, if you look at a global scale, we're seeing not too many active exploitations. And I think one of the reasons of that is that everyone panicked in the beginning and ran out there and patched as soon as they could. So the actual window of exposure was reasonably small. However, because all of these things are so embedded and it's very difficult to find all the instances of vulnerable Log4js, it's going to be haunting us for quite a long time, and you will be seeing this pop up every now and again in unexpected places. The prevention methods, of course, the best one is to patch, but however, there are mitigating measures that our customers have also put in place, and you will see bypasses for those mitigation measures. So don't count on those, don't fully rely on those, patch. That's the best. And of course, if you haven't done that already, then you should consider yourself compromised. Well, the last bullet point, of course, was not relevant anymore. Now we've had Christmas. Some customers actually decided to just simply take everything offline over Christmas and give the sysadmins a happy holiday. I think the Dutch Chamber of Commerce was one of those companies that sent out a mail to all their clients, like, we're offline for Christmas. It's Log4j related. Have a great day. So with that, I would also like to say have a great day. And of course, if there are questions, I'd be very, very happy to answer them. Sander, I can't see the question chat. Do you have any questions in the box?
Yeah, thank you, Ralph, for the clear explanation on this vulnerability. Before we go into the questions, I would like to mention this webinar is recorded and will be made available afterwards, so that everybody knows about it. Most of the questions are focused internally on internal risks, but one of the questions also is the URLs we shared in the presentation about operating systems and functionality that is or isn't vulnerable. Can we share them with them, and is that also easily accessible for everybody?
Yes, it is very easily accessible for everybody. So first of all, the presentation itself, I don't know if we have that, so the slides, whether they are on the website currently, but our webmaster should be able to answer that question. I will get back to that in a minute. In terms of the NCSC GitHub repository, that is a public URL. You don't need access to that, so anyone can go there. So if you just go to github.com/ncsc-nl, you will be able to find the GitHub repository with all the vulnerable products information listed right there.
And only the vulnerable ones, or also the ones that aren't vulnerable?
No, actually, that's a very good question. It's not just only the vulnerable ones, it's also the ones that have been patched, and also some products that are known to be not vulnerable.
Yep. Great.
The list is quite comprehensive.
Okay, one of the other questions is if we didn't patch the internal systems yet, are we in danger then now?
Yes, of course, because stuff is logged there. If there is any kind of outside input that is not validated, then it is definitely a possibility that data will end up there and trigger that payload. So yes, definitely, Log4j, if it is used and not patched, the risk remains.
Okay, and I think it's from the same questionnaire. Are there also alternatives to take into account for logging functionality, or do you have guides of best practices concerning Log4j?
Well, of course there are alternatives. It's just that this package is comprehensive and used in a lot of software stacks. So if you have a software development department and you can, choose yourself what logging package is used, then yeah, you can use any alternative that you want. However, usually the case is that this is just an embedded component in a product, an off-the-shelf product that you purchased, and in that case you're dependent on the vendor to fix that problem. So you don't really have a say in it. You can just update the software from the vendor, and that's it.
Yeah, and concerning the best practices, we already explained some things about how to analyze post-breach. You can also use that for safekeeping, besides patching, which we strongly recommend. Well, the only thing that left me is thank you so much for the attention. Wishing all the visitors best year Hope you all have yourself a sparkling and safe 2022. And we also have a slide concerning the survey, which will pop up immediately after this webinar. Hope you guys can fill it out, and we can improve our webinars even more. Thank you again. Have a lovely day, and wishing you all a safe year.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sander.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
you too, Ralph. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.